Welcome everybody to a new edition of Quarantine Talks. Tonight we have the pleasure to have Ivan Bernal to join us. Ivan is a graduate from SCI-Arc from class 2011. Currently, he's the director of the Architecture and Urban Design programs at Kent State University College of Architecture and Environmental Design in Ohio. Before that, he taught in Rensselaer Polytechnic, not Rensselaer Polytechnic, in Syracuse. Somehow in my head, they're both always in this kind of a weird parts of New York State. So I always mix
Same
them.
area.
Same area, same cold, same desolation. He taught in Syracuse for years, and before that, he taught for a bit in SCI-Arc as well. So originally from Colombia, via Miami, Florida, he came to SCI-Arc. And I have the opportunity to visit recently the school at Kent University that Ivan is running, and he's doing a remarkable job with a fantastic young group of young faculties and doing really great work. So it's a pleasure to have him. Ivan and I, we talk about it like everybody else in the context of this series of conversation. We ask each of our guests to talk about their thesis. And since the majority of the audience here are people who are going through thesis or the last semester in their postgrad, so it's an interesting conversation how whatever they did at the end of their career as a student became or not the foundation of what they did, what they developed and they're developing later. It's a great pleasure. Ivan is a dear friend, and I think he's a remarkable educator, a remarkable designer. So I'm very pleased that he has the time to share with us. So Ivan, the Zoom screen is all yours.
Thank you, Hernán. Well, let me share my screen here. Well, hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back to talk here at SCI-Arc, and thank you, Hernán, for the invitation again, especially relating to this topic of thesis. I guess, like Hernán mentioned, I'll try to focus the presentation to the current thesis students who are in the middle of developing their projects, and hopefully you use this time at school and everything that you're learning as an opportunity to set in motion an amazing career in your futures. So I wasn't sure how to frame the presentation, and since it revolves around thesis as a departure point, I think I'll try to make it in a kind of like a chronological journey through my career the last 9 years, during and post after thesis, and the impact that the work that I developed during that summer and the semester before that had in all the work that I developed since. Some of it might be evident, some of it might not be evident, but one thing for sure is something that totally informs all my decisions as a designer, as an educator, as a school director, as a practitioner, academic, and all the many hats that I wear and that hopefully many of you will wear in the future. So let me just by emphasizing that I can relate. It seems that it was not that long ago that I was in the middle of this process. So I can sympathize with everything that you're going through. This is a roller coaster, especially at SCI-Arc. And as many of you don't know already and have experiences filled with small victories, frustrations, self-criticism, mastering of techniques, and a lot of reading and modeling in the middle of all of these. I have experienced this process in 3 different perspectives. One as a student developing thesis, then later on I advised some thesis students at both SCI-Arc and Syracuse, and I've been in multiple thesis reviews as invited guest, invited jury. So I think I have a good perspective on how to develop and kind of like examine and evaluate some thesis project. So the key here is that this time is probably one of the most productive times that you would have in the next decade. And I don't say that lightly. It's a moment where you're fully devoted to developing a project and try to germinate something that would last hopefully at least 5 years in your career. And I really want to advise you to truly enjoy this time and make the best of it, especially during the current situation. I think because it forces you to be somewhat indoors and connected to the screen. I think thesis is a good outlet for you to kind of like express yourself personally and as a designer, a creative person to the world. And this format would actually allow itself. It would be it would be good for you to use this format to be able to push your work out. Um, so out, I mean, in publications, in magazines, in all kinds of digital and physical print that you can find to be able to get your ideas out. So going back to my thesis, a lot of the work that I do looks at the way we experience the world. It questions kind of like its truthfulness, and it opens doors for what I used to call fake realities. Later, I decided to kind of define it more as alternative realities or parallel understandings. It's a result of the research I developed back as a student, again, doing thesis, trying to define what was the audience of the projects I was developing, and who could participate to some fashion in the projects, who could engage in them. So this door led to an evaluation in how we experience shape and the way we engages with spaces and images. So it is reasonable to believe that we see that through history we've seen primitives as a way of expressing monumentality. We've seen it as a way of expressing religiousness, utopian dreams. Primitive shapes, in addition to simple Boolean operations and mutations between them, can create complex spatial systems that retain a high level of formal legibility and clarity. Primitives carry a sense of intrinsic value and formal expectancy that can be used to capture users. Since childhood, we have been playing with these basic shapes, creating a predisposition to them. We have experienced them. We know what to expect. We know the formal exploration. We know that these formal explorations can trigger a high level recognition to which most people can relate to. Kind of like primitives, and especially familiar primitives, they flicker between a state of familiarity and uncertainty, kind of like, and it opens the door for a degree of interpretation as well. So as a given, probably because of the context of SCI-Arc and the time that I was there, I was very much interested in spatial complexity, one that emerges from geometry and complexity in familiar primitives and combinations with them. But I also was interested in creating an audience that was able to develop association bridging multiple people, and one that could be understood kind of like its raw core. So I also wanted to further explore the notion of audiences and entropy as a design tool, and not necessarily as a result of decay. This led me to develop a project that was sited in Havana, Cuba, and was looking for some sense of play without relying solely on its ability to fit in. So the project was developed with those simple ambitions. I think at the end, most theses boil down to kind of like simple things that we know we're interested on in our previous studio projects and our careers, but it takes a little bit for us to be able to like sift through the whole thing and make some claims. So the project was developed in the pursuit of formal familiarity, exploring complex spatial arrangements, and entropy as a design tool to pursue an aesthetic that while age could fit neither a dystopian or utopian narrative. It was in a way negating a negative connotation for its state by creating a fakeness of the passing of time. And again, Havana, Cuba was the perfect setting to be able to do this. So under the advice of Hernán, Hernán was my advisor for the thesis project. It evolved through many different paths, and it developed an interest in latent behaviors. And I'll talk a little bit more about what latent behaviors are through animations and also through some physical and digital robotics that I developed in projects after moving post-thesis. So the project took place in Havana and El Malecón. It was playing off the tropes of what it meant to put something in Havana without making it look alien, but also trying to kind of arrange some of the aesthetics that were happening there, not only because of the, let's say, the cultural aspects and the financial implications that that it's going through, but also kind of like the period that happened right after the revolution. and the evolution that architecture happened that saw during the first 10 years of the revolution. So one advice that I can give students is while you're developing your projects, or you're trying to establish both a social and political and formal agenda and aesthetic agenda, it's also very important to understand the role of representation. For me, representation is something that keeps me anchored to current themes, especially tools and techniques. And it's also something that I always turn to when I find myself in a state of a stagnant state, or something that kind of like I find a barrier in any project. I think representation can operate as a generative tool. And it's something that so far it hasn't failed me. So it's a good idea to use thesis and use the time of thesis to explore different representation techniques, and then put that in your repertoire, and also keep adding to it as you become better designers and you pursue different kind of projects. So this shot in particular is of the section of the thesis, and I was trying to find a way in which we could, this by now seems kind of normal, but back then I was trying to find a way to be able to show depth through the form, through the three-dimensionality, but at the same time achieve some level of legibility and layering as while kind of like posturing some kind of scale as well. So this is the section that emerged of it, and as you know, I had many friends help me, undergrad and grad students coming in help me in thesis. It's a team effort for sure. I don't think anyone can do it on their own, and if they do, it's obviously not going to be as successful. So take the time to ask for help and make sure that you recruit some good people for thesis. And then the final thesis presentation, it seems, this image seems kind of old to me, but the thesis very present, had an animation established in the middle that set the story and the narrative that emerged from the project, but also it had a series of iterations of decay and entropy paired with formal legibility. Those are the little models that you see there. One of those was donated to the UNESCO, and then some of the models, the big models on the right, went to the Wallpaper magazine for publication there. And there's a zooming of one of the physical models for you to understand kind of like the layering and the intensive work that went into modeling and actually mastering the digital craft to be able to produce this kind of geometry. So like I said, one good thing about putting the effort in your thesis, one of the many good things about putting the effort into thesis, is that it leads to you starting your career as a designer if you already don't have one. So my thesis won the first prize for the Soccer Punch competition, which led to a prototype being built in Lexington, Kentucky, and a book being published called Fresh Punches. It was published in an exhibition in Barcelona about rethinking cities. It made the graduate directory at Wallpaper magazine in 2011. It also was part of a publication with File magazine, among many other things. So it does pay off. All the work that you put into it, it does pay off. And then that same line of work then was exhibited in other exhibitions that was not about thesis, but would allow me to develop work to be exhibited in museums, in schools, in symposiums, in workshops, some of them going as far as Thailand, and some here in Ohio, some at the GSD, LA, and so on. And later on, one of the hats that I was able to wear is in a collaboration and partnership with A+D Museum. I was able to become a guest curator for them, and with the help of some friends, we developed the three-way show in which we invited, I believe it was about 15 creatives and designers to project projects that they have developed in these primitive shapes inside the A+D Museum. And at the same time, we developed the architecture play, which was a year-long event taking place in a class setting here in Kent as a theory class in collaboration with Tony Murray and Clemens Finkelstein. But also it was a symposium and roundtable in which we invited a collection of about 20 people to come discuss the role of play in architecture in its many, many shapes. So moving a little bit to the research, all of the research that I developed during thesis led to my initial research coming out of school, which was also dealing with patterns, form, and metrics. It was a way of using graphics as a way to understand three-dimensionality through just distortion of metrics, but also shadows. And in very, very simple exercises, a way in which patterns can deform uh, with the distortion of geometry, but at the same time, they can define geometry with the movement of patterns. So while these animations are somewhat crude, it actually set up the board for me to develop a series of projects that came after this. Here are a few more examples of that, in which you're really trying to track the metrics and the patterns and the black and white contrast as a way of understanding tridimensionality and creating this latency that I talk about, behavior latency in three-dimensional form and textures. This also was part of a research that I started about 2 years ago, looking into the evolution of surface shaders in the architecture field, dating back to around 1995. And how it evolved from the definition of form and trying to illustrate what was the, let's say, the craft of form manipulation into actually evolving as its own kind of like logic, moving into 2.5D, 2.5D, and three-dimensional bone maps and textures that then later on became its own kind of like topic. This is one of the first projects that we developed in partnership with Kayla Hernandez and Sofia Zavala. It was a submission for the Ragdoll competition. And this project, funny enough, emerged as a narrative. We wrote a script for it. It was a stage that was supposed to have 3 lives. And once we wrote the script, we started designing the geometry and how it would come apart and break and have different lives, details, how plants became a part of its kind of like being and behavior, how it would roll in the side and how it could be occupied in many different fashions. Part of the brief of this project needed for it to come apart. So we developed this thing as a way of planters. So we had 5 giant modules that then would break into smaller portions, that they would break into smaller portions. And it would find its way just follow with some of the Illinois plants, and it would eventually decay over time. The second project, it was a birdwatch tower that we developed. This similarly was trying to use pattern, and in this specific project, the pattern was actual a physical object that became joints, and also it was a way to describe unblurred geometry, to be able to create an undefined silhouette, but at the same time creating moments of density, as you can see in some of the images. And the whole thing, it was just an experience across a bridge that would lead into a series of platforms for bird watching. We didn't win this competition, obviously, but it actually helped us understand the role of arrays, densities, joints, and discrete objects in a way that we can produce kind of like the ambitions that we set up with the initial research. Later on, some of these similar topics appear in an entry competition that I did with Kayla Hernandez, with Yu Tin Sheng, and with Brandon Hudak for the micro house competition, which were looking into a small lot, small kind of footprint house, trying to maximize the use of the house, but that had like a big character. So that was kind of like the joke around, is that we're looking into a small house with big characters. And we're trying to change the notion of interiority and landscape. The whole house only measure about 4 meters in width. And it has these areas of expansion. The whole fabrication, we were thinking about the fabrication about having this demising wall that was actually the core structure of it, and everything would attach to it. And it would get this fur as a way to deal with light and to also change over time. It would grow vegetation as well in its feathers or fur, however you want to call it, but it will provide some kind of environmental logic behind the texture and the shadow that it would provide. Here are some shots of the interior. And it's funny because this project then led to a studio that I did, I taught last fall here at Kent, that I'll show at the end of the presentation. Moving from different skills from the interiority, we move into a little bit of furniture as well. This is a piece that is being currently fabricated in Colombia. It's a little side table, but the logic of this table was to use simple CNC machining with very easy manufactured components in which each of the panels could be milled and then assembled together. Again, dealing with the notion of behavior and rotation as a way to give light to this pieces, the teacups and everything would be something very temporal. The rotation of the table could be temporal, but also its rotation could be temporal. So it's something that, depending on the ambition of the person who was using it, could actually change his behavior and personality over time. So when we started talking about this idea of latent behavior, at some moment in the past 9 years, I became somewhat oversaturated with the screen, and I wanted to test some things in, let's say, in the physical world. And the first iteration of that was this robotics installation that happened at the Why Not stand, where we developed this set of I don't know how to call bodies that were under the bed and would start moving in all kinds of way when people, due to the proximity of the people. Also, there were these watchers back here, and we're trying to set the mood, and these things would move in the back and try to set the mood to what was going on. The setting of the one night stand was a motel. This was the first iteration, and we could only do it for very low budget, and it would only be up for I believe it was like 8 hours. So this is the first iteration of that. And then this object was for an exhibition at Syracuse University. It was having the same behavior. It was a faculty exhibition, and it was set on a table, and about every 2 to 3 hours it would start rotating and shaking, and then it would go back to normal. So for the second version of the one night stand, and I believe I was the only person to do the one night stand twice. I don't know why, but that's the case. This was a collaboration with Casey Ream, in which we designed the room with these things that would track your movements based on Kinects, and then they will start reacting to your proximity and how you behave around them. And we also did some rear projection on the mirrors in the room, and there were all kinds of things that were happening in the projections with music and some weird videos that Casey Ream came up with. So a little bit about teaching. That research about the kinetics and the robotics led to two visual studies that I did at SCI-Arc, actually, both of them dealing with this notion of animation, live controls of apparatuses, and also simulations and animations. So it was a series of just very simple live components dealing with Arduinos and animations, trying to figure out how to make things move, but not only how to make things move, how to have things occupy a realm of behavior. So that we're, in a sense, generating a reaction to them. We have students doing gear, some students hack some PO kind of like model kits. Some students were building their own 6-axis road arms. And it was just on a way to look into robotics as a way to produce reactions, but also as a way to produce some kind of comfort. I think these classes were really successful in that way. And then after that, the class that followed was a class dealing with, again, textures, form, and animation. That resulted in an exhibition that we put together, SCI-Arc, in which each student had a tablet, a 3D model, and in the tablet they were playing these animations. And what's really good about the animations, in my mind, is that it's the first time that the pattern was completely disassociated from the form. So as you look at these animations, the thing that you would notice is that there's really no correlation between the pattern and the form, but both of them are animated, and it's that sense of movement that actually bring the two pieces together. So we were trying to produce this absurdity between geometry, movement, texture mapping, and animation as a way to create kind of like a different kind of reality that people could understood outside the realm of let's say physics or what they saw as objects. So they're neither creatures nor objects, they're neither architecture, but they're also not like just industrial design or anything like that. We try to really, and some of them are more successful than others, but we're trying to really navigate this fine line between what they are, in a way, kind of like undescribable, and the more successful ones were the ones that I think you couldn't really describe what they were. These visual studies always were like super fun to teach, trying to get all the students on board with all the techniques and the tools to be able to to produce this kind of short clips. They also fabricated some models for this, but I don't think the physical models were as successful as the animations. I think in the animations when you can really trace the brief or the kind of like the polemic that the visual studies were trying to set up by kind of like the juxtaposing of and the layering of the two things, the geometry, the texture, the color, the bone maps, the movement of both of those in not in a choreographed way. Then moving on to another visual studies, this was a visual study that tried to trace back a little bit on the idea of cinematography and animations in architecture. And with a group of students in Syracuse, we were looking into just doing very like straightforward class. It was pairing film directors to movies, film directors to architecture. So we're trying to feed Quentin Tarantino to Archigram. We're trying to figure out what would happen if you put Scorsese with Santelia and the Italian Futurists and things like that. And at the end of it, they develop a series of animations that dealt with a lot of green screening and actually parallax effects, but also there was some animation involved as far as actually kinetics and IK handles and inverse kinematics that they were trying to deal with. These led to some students developing some thesis project at Syracuse based on these tools and techniques. And in general, I think the students were able to make that relationship. Like for example, like I think cliches or something like that, however you want to call them. For example, trying to look at Tarantino, we were looking into how he shoots feet. And like for example, this take in the opening of this part is how the walking city would take a shoot at the feet, would look at the feet of the whole overall structure and try to emphasize that as a part of the movie. And similarly in the next one, I think this one was trying to match Scorsese, like I said, to Santelia, and it was trying to really capture the ambience. I think is the best way of putting it, or the essence of both of those worlds, to be able to kind of like produce something that was neither one or the other, but a combination of the two, and it's always dealing with this duality between within the tool. And so I'll let this play for a little bit. I'll stop talking for about a minute and then I'll continue.
Oh, yeah, animals come out at night. Whores, skunk pussies, buggers, screams, fairies, dopers, junkies. Sick, venal. Someday a row rain will come and wash all this scum off the streets.
And at the same time, as Syracuse, as part of my teaching, I was teaching undergrad studios, second year studios, and that was a big shift for me, having been teaching with Hernán at SCI-Arc grad students, where students were very much prepared. To second year, I understood that I had to change my approach. So there was a lot of emphasis in representation and trying to understand simple but somewhat develop a craft for both digital model and representation. These are some of the studios that emerged out of those years of teaching there. Some of them more advanced than others, some of them more complex than others, some of them dealing with issues of the straight line to a curved line, some of them dealing with issues of peeling, of representation in moving images, of like complex, let's say, Maya modeling and things like that. And then finally, as part of the teaching, and I know I'm missing a lot, is this is the last studio that I taught here, a grad studio at Kent State, in which I was trying to shift from the objectness of the objecthood of everything that I was kind of like paying attention to, and try to emphasize interiority and how a project could emerge from the interior. So students were tasked with developing 4 scenarios around a narrative for a living condition, either a family or friends or roommates, any kind of inhabitation in any kind of context that actually was productive in a way to producing some kind of legible space that was not related one space to the other. So they were not producing houses, they were producing isolated spaces that were connected solely through kind of like the aesthetic or the language of each of these projects. Um, Obviously, you can see in some of the impact that tracing back to my thesis it has on teaching, but for the most part, when I teach, I try to give agency to students as a way for them to find their own kind of like take on what they're interested on while keeping kind of like a high level of craft and dedication and commitment to what they're working on. So this project was done by Daniela Hoover. Previously, we saw Nina, I forgot her last name. Before that, we're looking at Ben Saivas. Um, this is Vince Noche. And again, all of these projects, it was 4 episodes. It was called interior episodes. And this project in particular was dealing with moss as a living creature inside a house and how it became a second character on the occupancy of this interiority. This one was dealing with the whole idea of purchasing and producing stuff, and how house actually became just an object of that. It became the actual interpretation of the living conditions and the living style of this person. And then the last one by Nico Teofilactos, he was dealing with the notion of a person having 2 personalities and occupying at the same time 2 different spaces in a house. Everything was coded through color, lighting, and carefully choreographed, in which you can actually understand the space as a sequence in itself and a relationship to the next space adjacent to it, but you could never see a physical connection between any of them. And I think I'll leave it at that. And then maybe we can do some questions and.
Thank you, Ivan.
Sure. Yep.
This is the moment that we invite whoever is watching YouTube, if they want to join us to the Zoom room for the Q&A and conversation part. Everybody's welcome. Like always, everybody here, feel free to write in the chat or directly ask a question directly to Ivan. So maybe to get us going, I would like you to talk a little bit more. I'm intrigued by the relation between, I don't know, obsession is the right word, but your relentless commitment to Platonic primitive geometry. But then it's interesting in the notion of the kinetics. There's maybe a connection in both of them. I think the value of Platonic geometries is one that is recognizable and is familiar, and then by certain manipulations, it always reminds us that we know that they exist there. And in a way, the kinetics also start with something that tries to replicate somehow movement that we know. But both of them, they get deviated from the point of departure. So I wonder if you see that there is a direct correlation between both of them, or they all belong to kind of two different interests that it may converge or not, but they are dealing with 2 different trajectories that you're interested in doing your work as a designer, as as an educator.
Yeah, I think those are 2 different tracks. The way that I probably tell myself that they make sense together is that both of them rely on latency. Latency meaning that they exist prior to the manipulation. So to some degree, they have an origin. And their evolution is always compared, the second version of that thing is always compared to its origin. So when you manipulate a primitive, a 3-dimensional primitive, you understand that it can be traced back to its origin in the same way that in kinetics or in cinema, you can always trace the next frame to the one previous to it. And the strength of both of those is actually by able to trace the change or the mutation or the translation from one to the other. So for me, both of them operate within the realm of time-based. They both kind of like exist non as a static object. I know that it might be both, it's a stretch, but it's when I was dealing with platonics, I think kinetics and metrics was the one thing, distortion in metrics and the patterns and all of this. It was the one thing that was allowing me to move into a time-based kind of like design platform instead of trying to create kind of like static things. One is by familiarity and recognition. The other one is purely by just looking at it. You can trace its change.
Ivan, thank you.
Go ahead, Marceline.
Oh, question about, I just wondered, thank you so much for the lecture. I was very curious, at what point did you realize that you wanted to become an educator? And how did that kind of evolve? Like how, because I think some of our students in the audience might be thinking about academic careers in the future. So it would be interesting to hear your story of how that evolved. Thanks.
So I was always interested in it, let's say since undergrad. But one thing is that after SCI-Arc, I had probably the luxury of working with Hernán in the office and being able to understand the value that academia brings into architecture outside of the profession of architecture. And I have to be careful because I'm the director of a school, so I need to be a little bit careful about what to say, but the value and the role that academia has in pushing the boundaries of the profession of architecture to be in a somewhat uncomfortable zone. And once it reaches its uncomfortable zone, being able to actually evolve into something more than what it's not. So not that not that the role of academia is solely to push the profession, but it's also its ability to speculate beyond the limits of what we currently understand on what architecture is. It was very hard to think of how you do that solely being in the professional side, and my interest in always trying to push beyond directly led me to academia, and also obviously the context while working with Hernán and teaching at SCI-Arc. I was also collaborating with Jackie and Florencia in some projects as well. So everything, it was the context, the situation, and probably my desire to kind of like push things a little bit outside its limits.
Anybody else? In the meantime, one thing I find that I was the micro house was a super, to me was very interesting to take the idea how you will take certain kind of a prosaic quality and then by the augmentation of that. So can you talk a little bit more about that house? I thought that was an interesting moment of inflection in the work about dealing with kind of a more rigid giving condition, let's say, and trying to find moments in which you can push out of that.
Yeah, I think it goes back actually to when I was in thesis. I think I think it was Moss who gave a lecture about, I think it was the 20%, something like that. And I always went back to that I think we all have these ups and downs about how we position ourselves in architecture and kind of like the compromises that we're willing to take and how we take that as a design challenge. So accepting let's say a compromise of some kind of metric and a normative to formal normative to a house, but then being able to find the specific moments in which you can actually inject some of these things that you're interested on and trying to balance that percentage of how much is normal, how much is not, where you start injecting things. So it was a little bit more surgical. I think that house was one of the few that we were looking into, let's say, we were looking into the realm of fabrication and really thinking through the process, how this would come to life in the built environment, how we bring it to life in a manageable way. And this also happened because at the same time, I haven't talked about that, and I don't think this is the stage to talk about it, but we're developing some projects in Colombia. We're doing some houses and some mid-rise buildings and things like that, that at the same time, this serves as an exploration to be able to do that without completely kind of like relinquishing our ambitions for what we had in the project, in the project of us as designers.
Cool. Anybody else in the chat or just voice your question?
No questions.
I have a question. I took Hernán's kitchen, so his kitchen talk is not at the kitchen. So thank you, Ivan. That was great. You know, it was really nice to see the career path. You know, we had a thesis this summer. We have career day, and now we have this. And to quote Christy, we always show the career arc. You know, for all the, you know, the guests, which are the faculty. So I think it's really nice to see your career arc today. I wanted to say, I remember Rachel showed me some photos of the last studio that you taught that focused more on interiority, the last images that you shown. So I thought that I was a, you know, amazing studio and work. And I wanted to ask you how you start to kind of introduce that from more of the kind of, you know, the view of massing, volume that you showed earlier, primitives and so on, into site and context. And then that work, you know, shifting towards, you know, even the robotic objects, they seem to be always about the objects, you know. And now it's more about like the section of those objects. So I thought it was a nice loop onto you know, advancing that work. So I mean, my question was like, do you think that's a kind of a shift from that thesis project that took many years in the making, you know, in the afterlife of SCI-Arc, and that kind of that last studio? And one note just for the students also, I thought it was wonderful how you shown how the thesis has a longer life, you know, publications, you know, exhibitions, and, you know, and so you know, you just keep on advancing that until you're totally tired of it. So I thought that was a really nice you know, thing that you did for them.
Yeah, for that studio, I was teaching that studio with Brendan Ho, who's a SCI-Arc alumni, who's living here in Kent. So he was super helpful in the studio, and part of it was a reaction to kind of like the discourse that we were having here at SCI-Arc. And to be honest, I was putting a little bit of my director role in the way that I was trying to balance off the notion of objectness or objecthood that was just recurring. And not that I have anything against it, it's just I was just playing like a balance act. But it actually led to something super interesting, that by removing an objecthood, you really have to look into the interiority. But by looking into the interiority, you really need to look into the section and how you design solely from silhouettes and sections, something that has the potential to be three-dimensional. So it's funny because the studio was full of constraints. Like, for example, one constraint that I don't know if it's obvious in the studio is the students were not allowed to orbit. They could only work in the front view. They were never allowed to orbit. And all their models and all the 3D models, obviously some of them actually orbit, but that was the prescription. Everything was developed flat as 2D that then gained three-dimensionality without being able to rotate. That actually was looking back into cinematography and how you can actually really frame shots through a static camera. I was, for the most part, developing animations prior to this that emphasized three-dimensionality, but some of the work that we were doing at Syracuse, it was actually just looking into layers of 2 dimensions and how you can actually create a lot of depth by moving foreground, middle ground, and background at different kind of speeds. So those animations pair with the kind of like ambition of removing objecthood from the scene and the limitation for students to orbit, and it was kind of like efficiency. We didn't want students to spend too much time orbiting around things, led to a studio that just it had to do with interiority. There was no other way to look at it. It was actually black boxes to be able to produce these images. These are just renders, but they were produced as alpha maps. as well with pixelations and different kind of layers in a black box. It was lit from behind. So all the light was controlled to different layers of little black dots or color dots that were blocking light from the back. So they really became three-dimensional by only looking at two-dimensional modeling. So in a way, it is kind of like counter to the thesis and some of the work, but in its being countering, I think it's actually very much related to it. I think many of us, we get to a point that the only way to look at what we're doing is to do the opposite of what we normally do. And it's also just an evolution of that project. So I do see in these projects a lot of what I was looking into the thesis, even if it's the total opposite of it.
If nobody else has a question, Ivan, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Great to have you back. We will be back on July 29th with Maya Alam, another alum. She will be speaking on the 29th. So looking forward to see all of you. Ivan, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for the lecture. Congratulations on the job you're doing there at Kent.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.